November 1941. The Western Desert, somewhere between Tobruk and the Libyan frontier. A column of British armoured vehicles is moving fast across open ground. At the rear of the column, one tank looks slightly different from the others. The paint is fresh, too fresh. The markings are almost right, but not quite. The crew inside are not British, they are German, and the gun is already traversing. That tank had been captured 3 days earlier. It had been repainted overnight. It had been loaded with German ammunition, and now it was driving in formation with the men it was about to kill. The vehicle that made this possible, the vehicle good enough that Rommel's men would risk everything just to keep using it, was called the M3 Stuart. British crews nicknamed it the Honey. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why a German field marshal, commanding the finest armoured force in the world, looked at a captured American light tank and decided it was worth more to him running than burning. You need to understand what the Desert War actually looked like before the Honey arrived. By mid-1941, British armour in North Africa was in crisis. The Matilda was too slow. The Crusader broke down constantly. The Valentine was reliable but undergunned. The men inside these vehicles knew that if they threw a track in the wrong place, or if the engine seized at the wrong moment, they were going to die. Not in combat, in the desert. Of thirst inside a steel box that had become an oven. The mechanical failure rate of British tanks in the first year of the Desert War was not a military secret. It was a catastrophe. Field commanders were filing reports that read more like confessions. Entire squadrons lost not to enemy fire, but to broken gearboxes, seized cooling systems, and tracks that simply disintegrated in the sand. The 8th Army was fighting two enemies simultaneously, the Afrika Korps and its own equipment. Then the Honey arrived. The M3 Stuart had been designed in America by a nation that was not yet at war, for a military that was still thinking about the last one. It was a light tank, 14 tons, 4 men, a 37mm gun in a rotating turret, powered by a 7-cylinder radial aircraft engine that produced 250 horsepower and could push the vehicle to 58 kilometers per hour on a flat road. That speed figure sounds modest in print. In the Western Desert in 1941, it was almost incomprehensible. The fastest German tank at that point, the Panzer III, topped out at around 40 kilometers per hour under ideal conditions. In sand and heat, considerably less, but speed alone does not explain the Honey's reputation. What the British crews discovered, and what the official record consistently underweights, was that the Stuart simply worked. The radial engine was an aircraft engine. It had been designed for a world where failure meant falling out of the sky. Its tolerances were extraordinary. Its maintenance requirements were understood by mechanics who had been trained on aircraft, not armoured vehicles, and in the brutal, grinding, heat-warped environment of the North African desert, a tank that worked every morning was worth more than a tank that was theoretically superior and sitting broken in the sand. Lieutenant Cyril Joly of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment recorded his first encounter with the Stuart in his memoir. He wrote that when he climbed into the turret for the first time, he noticed something he had not experienced in any British tank. It was clean. The instruments were readable, the gun traversed smoothly, the radio worked. These were not luxuries. In the desert, these were the difference between living and dying. The name came within days of the first combat deployment. No one is entirely certain who said it first. The account most often repeated is that a British crewman climbing out after a long desert patrol that would have destroyed a Crusader looked back at the Stuart and said simply, "She's a Honey." The name spread through the regiment within hours. Within a week, it had reached every British armoured unit in the theatre. The official designation, M3 Stuart, almost ceased to exist in daily use. She was the Honey. She would be the Honey for the rest of the war. Operation Crusader, launched November 18th, 1941, was the first major British offensive in which the Stuart fought in significant numbers. The 4th Armoured Brigade deployed roughly 165 Stuarts against the Afrika Korps at Sidi Rezegh. What followed was 3 days of fluid, fast-moving armoured combat across open desert that would later be studied in staff colleges as a textbook example of how speed changes the geometry of a battle. The Stuart's crews quickly learned that their 37mm gun was inadequate against the frontal armour of the Panzer IV. They also learned something else. The Panzer IV could not catch them. In a direct confrontation, the Stuart was outgunned. In a desert engagement fought at range and speed, the Stuart could dictate the terms of every contact. It could choose when to fight, it could choose when to leave. The German tanks could do neither. Major General Frank Mercevy wrote in his after-action report that the Stuart's mobility had fundamentally altered his tactical options. He now had a cavalry force that actually behaved like cavalry. It could screen, probe, strike, and withdraw faster than the enemy could respond. The Honey had given the 8th Army something it had not possessed since the war began: genuine armoured initiative. The Germans noticed. Of course they noticed. The Afrika Korps had been fighting British armour long enough to develop a clear hierarchy of threats. The Matilda they respected for its armour. The Crusader they had learned to wait out, knowing it would break down. The Valentine was an afterthought, but the Honey could not be waited out, could not be predicted, and could not be caught. Captured German field orders from late 1941 specifically instruct commanders not to pursue Stuart formations across open ground because the pursuit would fail and the pursuing vehicles would become isolated. The Germans were telling their own men not to chase a light tank because the light tank would win the race. The answer Rommel's forces settled on was simple: capture and reuse. The first confirmed instance of a Stuart being turned against its original owners occurred in December 1941. A damaged Stuart, abandoned during a British withdrawal, was recovered by elements of the 15th Panzer Division. The engine was intact. The gun was functional. Within 72 hours, the vehicle had been repainted in German markings and assigned to a reconnaissance unit. This was not an isolated incident. As the Desert War progressed through 1942, the practice became systematic. German recovery teams were specifically tasked with identifying intact or repairable Stuarts after engagements. Rommel's headquarters issued guidance on how to maintain the radial engine, guidance translated from American technical manuals, captured with the vehicles. The Afrika Korps had become, in effect, a secondary operator of a tank it had not purchased, had not been trained on, and could not resupply through normal channels. That they went to this trouble at all is the most precise possible measure of what the Honey was worth. The crews who survived those encounters on the British side described something deeply unsettling: the moment of recognition. A tank that looked like yours, moved like yours, sounded like yours, the silhouette identical, the engine note the same, and then the gun traversing the wrong way and the understanding arriving a second too late. There is a specific incident documented in the war diary of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars from February 1942. A patrol of 4 Stuarts encountered what appeared to be a damaged British vehicle being towed by another. When the patrol leader closed to 300 meters to investigate, he noticed that the markings were slightly wrong. He ordered an immediate reversal. The German crew opened fire at 200 meters. 2 British Stuarts were hit. 1 was destroyed. The patrol leader survived. In his report, filed the same evening, he noted that he had hesitated for approximately 4 seconds before giving the order to withdraw because the tank he was looking at was mechanically and visually identical to his own. 4 seconds. In a tank battle, 4 seconds is the difference between a report filed and a name on a memorial. By the time production ended in 1944, more than 22,000 M3 and M5 Stuarts had been built. It was supplied to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Brazil, and over a dozen other nations. It fought in the Pacific, where its speed made it more useful than heavier vehicles in jungle terrain. It fought in Burma and Italy. It served in reconnaissance and flanking roles across Western Europe, long after heavier tanks had taken its frontline position. A design conceived for one war proved useful in every corner of the next one. They called it the Honey, not because it was sweet or gentle or easy to use. They called it the Honey because in the middle of a desert war that was killing men through mechanical failure, as reliably as through enemy fire, a tank that worked, that actually, consistently without argument, worked, felt like something you did not have a military word for. The military word for what it felt like was honey. Warm and reliable and exactly what you needed in a place that was trying to kill you. Rommel's men knew it too. That is why they repainted one and drove it back into the fight. That is why German field orders warned against pursuing it. That is why captured American technical manuals were translated into German and issued to mechanics who had never been trained on anything like it. The Honey was not the biggest tank in the desert. It was not the most heavily armored. Its 37mm gun was obsolete by 1942 against anything the Germans fielded. On paper, it had no business being the vehicle the Afrika Korps most wanted to keep. And yet, when Rommel's men found one in the sand that still had fuel in the tank, they did not strip it for parts. They repainted it, they loaded it, they climbed inside. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story.